Joining me today is the leader of the Liberal Democrats, Senator David Leyonhjelm. Thanks for being here, David.
Good to be with you.
Okay, so I have a ton of questions, but I think obviously the most important one is, are you an Australian citizen?
Well, as far as I know, I'm a fifth generation Australian on both sides of my family. But, you know, if the Libyans or the North Koreans have made me a citizen in the last 12 months or so and just not bothered to tell me, then I wouldn't know about that. So, you know, it does depend on what we mean by an Australian citizen and how we got there.
Yeah.
But when the High Court tells us what it all means, then, you know, we'll be a lot wiser. But so far, so good.
Okay, then. So in addition to being an Australian, you are a libertarian, which is somewhat of a rare breed today in politics. So I want to ask you about selling the libertarian message. But firstly, put a bit of context around that. A study out of ANU said that since 1969, trust in politicians has not been this low. So average Australians seem to be wise to the fact that politicians are not performing, but they still seem to be conditioned to see government as providing the answers. So with the libertarian philosophy that sort of says, get the government out of the way and let people deal with their own lives, take control over their own lives, how do you sell a libertarian ideal to a public that's still hooked on government solutions?
It's a paradox that people are annoyed with government, don't trust government, then they expect governments to do the things that they think need to be done. You're quite right. How do you sell it? There are several approaches. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. Obviously, there's some people who believe in small government, but they will say, they'll respond to a message that says government is a problem, not the solution. Get on better without being told how to live their lives by the government, that they're better off spending their own money, doing their own thing, and the government should only be there for the things that they absolutely can't do for themselves, and perhaps providing a safety net for the poor who are out of luck. So there are some people who are quite responsive to that message. They, like I and you, we call ourselves libertarians. The reality is, though, in political terms, there's not enough of us. We could probably only count on, maybe 2% of the population. The Libertarian Party in the United States, although their system is a little different, it's a winner-takes-all approach, so small parties tend to not do well there for that reason. But at its best, the Libertarian Party never expects to do more than just a few percent. So that's not enough. What we have to do to sell that message is convince people that they can do well by themselves, or that they need to be left alone. Donald Trump did this during his election campaign. He got votes from all kinds of groups who didn't particularly want anything from the government, they just wanted to be left alone. And in many cases, they weren't libertarians, but they weren't expecting the government to do anything in their particular instance. They were simply saying, on my particular issue, the thing that animates me, that motivates the way I vote, being left alone is the best option.
Right. So
if we can get enough people like that, and, to give a few examples, there would be motorbike riders who don't like being treated as if they're stupid because they ride motorbikes. I'm a bike rider, and we all know that if you fall off, it hurts. But we ride voluntarily, and we don't need the government to tell us we're stupid. Smokers are in the same boat. Firearm owners, there are lots of people who make decisions for themselves, knowing full well that other people would not regard that decision as particularly smart, but they do it anyway, and they want to be left alone. There are quite a lot in that category. So I think there's hope for my party, the Liberal Democrats, if we can gather up people like that in a similar fashion to the way Donald Trump did in his campaign. It's been said that his success was a result of angry white middle class, white working class voters voting for him. There's just not enough of them to have accounted for his success. Yes, he did get them, but he also got a lot of other people, a lot of other sort of demographic or economic groups who just wanted to be left alone.
Yeah. So on that theme, recently a young man by the name of Samuel Gunning, 23-year-old law student, was elected to the North Sydney Council. He's a Liberal Democrat, and he was running what his competitors described as a ghost campaign. So, which is basically he didn't run a campaign. So how did that happen?
Well, it helps when we run and the Liberal Party don't, or they don't under their own name. Yep. North Sydney also has a history of electing independents. You might remember Ted Mack held that seat for some years as an independent. And so they're comfortable electing non-mainstream people. Yep. The Liberal Party ran, well, they didn't officially run anybody. There was nobody there nominated by the Liberal Party. There are 2 tickets, I think, 2 tickets by Liberal Party members. And they ran as independents, though, on their 2 tickets. But none of them identified as Liberal. And the other parties as well. And we ran as the Liberal Democrats. And we also got number 1 on the ballot. And we know that some people don't give a stuff about who wins, so they'll vote for number 1. Right. There are a number of people who vote for any party as long as it's got Liberal in their name. Right. And then there are other people who vote for the Liberal Democrats because they've heard me. They didn't hear from Samuel, our candidate, because he didn't have much to say. But they've heard from me. I get recognised pretty much everywhere I go these days. And the people who are listening and thinking about it and agreeing with me some of the time and not other times. And it's, we are having an impact. And I think in North Sydney, there are quite a lot of people there who are conscious of the fact that government sticks its hand in their pockets a lot. Yep. And they're not all that happy with it. And they know about our message of low tax and they like that idea.
Yeah. That's great. If I could shift gears now and talk about something you talked about on Mark Latham's Outsiders, which is the Liberal Democrats' proposed tax policy. And by way of setting this up, Dick Smith recently came out and proposed to raising the highest personal income tax rate to 65% and the corporate tax rate from 30% to 45%, which I've called a form of economic suicide. Now, your tax policy goes in the opposite direction. Seeks to put more money in people's pockets. And so could you just outline your flat tax proposal?
So our policy is for a tax-free threshold of $40,000 and then a flat tax of 20% after that. Our company tax policy is 20%. And we would also abolish the special taxes such as on alcohol, tobacco, petrol, gambling. So, a much, much reduced tax environment. It has its pluses and minuses. There is an argument for taxing income from the very first dollar so that people know that they are contributing to the things that the government provides. New Zealand does that. And you could probably achieve the same overall effect as our policy if you adjusted the rates down. But the other side of that argument is that collecting income tax from people on incomes of below $40,000 probably costs more than you get anyway. Right. So from an administrative point of view, you're actually better off. And then you can also mount the argument that if you're not paying any tax, then you really have no right to demand anything back from the government anyway, because you haven't contributed to it. Yep. So, there's arguments both ways. The general impression, though, or the overall effect that I want to emphasise is it would leave a great deal more of our earnings in our own pockets. Yep. And that's a good thing. We spend our money far better than any government can do. Now, just take a few practical examples. We pay for the education of kids. Now, suppose we paid less tax so that we had, on average, say, $12,000 per person per year in our pockets, greater than what we have now, one way or another, money through paying lower tax. We could then shop around the schools that are seeking to educate our kids with those $12,000 and say, well, which school is going to do the best job of educating my kids? that schools would compete. Some would say, well, I'll do it for $10,000.
Right.
And others will say, well, I might charge $13,000. They might say, I'll charge $13,000, but I guarantee your kid will be much better educated than they would be if they went to another school.
Yep.
So, in other words, you would get competition for something. You pay that $12,000 to the government, and then the government basically tells you what school you've got to send your kids to, unless you're prepared to spend a lot more money and send them to a private school. And you have no say over the quality of the school that your kids attend. And, you're basically stuck with what you're given by the government. And everybody who's had anything to do with government spending knows that a substantial amount of waste occurs. Yep. That's just one example. There are multiple examples where you could manage your own money and to provide the services that the government currently provides, and you would get either a better quality product or service or a cheaper product or service. And the service providers would compete for your business, and they would all do a better job.
Yeah, just on the education issue, the government put through Gonski 2.0, and yet they didn't tie that to any kind of outcomes for students. So they're spending a lot more money, but they didn't require that the schools would show in any particular way that they'd spent that money wisely through better outcomes for students or higher grades or whatever else it was supposed to accomplish. Can you comment on that? Do I have that right?
Not quite. They are pushing ahead pretty hard with the NAPLAN testing and comparison of schools based on NAPLAN. That's interesting that NAPLAN was a Labor government, the Gillard initiative. Of course, the education unions hate it because it creates competition and puts them on notice that their performance will be, be checked. No, the government is actually interested in performance, but they are very tentative about it. Gonski was an improvement in terms of overall policy, but still there's massive flaws in school education. We still have money going to the schools directly from the government. There's no real incentive for the schools to try to attract kids. Milton Friedman's policy of school vouchers would be far, far superior. So if the government said, well, every kid has a voucher attached to his or her head of $12,000, and the kids are able to go wherever they like, and the school gets the benefit of that voucher wherever the kids are, and then you would have schools competing for the kids. And on top of that, though, you need to have the owners or the leaders of the school or the principals of the school being able to sack the useless teachers and attract better quality teachers through higher pay. So there are significant cultural changes, if you like, required to do that. And Gonski's the big thing there is funding schools based on social and economic status, right? And they have been taking the address, the SES status of the address of the parents, and applying that to the school and saying, well, that school gets so much funding, and this is non-government schools, so much funding according to the address. So you could, if you live in a very wealthy area, but you happen to be poor, it's assumed that because you live in that area that you're wealthy, and the school will get less funding as a result, and vice versa. You could be a multimillionaire, send your kids to a school which is dominated by kids from areas which are poor, and that school will get a lot more funding. It's a very silly formula in my view. It could be vastly improved. But in fairness, and they did throw another $4 billion at school funding in order to win the crossbench over in the Senate to get that bill through. I voted against the bill for that reason, because I was opposed to the additional funding. But the underlying, you leave aside the additional money that's been thrown at it, the change in policy is actually a step in the right direction, but a great deal more improvement is required.
Yeah. Okay, maybe we'll move on to, well, we talked about the tax policy, but on the other side, to pay for tax cuts, you need to cut some spending, obviously, and this makes me salivate, actually, at the thought of cutting government spending. I picked this statistic up from something that you said a while back, that we have a labour force of about 13 or 14 million people in this country, but over 2 million are public servants. So that's more than 15% of our employed population are working for the government. And so what areas of government could we do away with to help pay for those tax cuts?
Yeah, a lot of people say that 2 million public servants is too many, and it is far too many. But that's 2 million across local, state, and federal government. And of course, they don't add to the economy; they just recycle money. And people say, "Oh, well, if we could get rid of one of the levels of government, and that would mean that we wouldn't need all the public servants that are attributable to that level." That's not something I agree with. I don't go with that one. The other levels of government would quickly expand to fill up the space created by the removal of that one level. Suppose you abolish the state government, local governments would grow, or Commonwealth government would grow, and as a result, that there would be no fewer public servants. What we have to do is find ways to get governments, all levels of government, to do less, to leave us alone, to let us do things for ourselves without the government spending our money and employing public servants to do those things. That's essentially what's required. Now, there's just no end of possibilities. I mean, I could talk for a long time about the areas where money could be cut. But I'll just give you, say, 3 examples. We have a Commonwealth Education Department, which employs thousands of public servants. Not one single school do they run, not one teacher teaching students do they employ.
Right.
And every state and territory government also has an education department, which does own schools, run schools, employ teachers, and teach kids. But we don't need to double up on that. Health department, same story. We have a federal health department, employs tens of thousands of public servants. Some of them are important. So the TGA, for example, which checks that medicines are safe before they're put on the market, although I think they're way too bureaucratic. But that function is probably worthwhile doing, and you would only want to do that with the national government. You wouldn't want that done 6 times because the state want to do it. But still, we have tens of thousands of public servants in the federal health department, and we have tens of thousands collectively in the state governments. The state governments run the hospitals, employ doctors and nurses and other health workers and that sort of thing. And, there's phenomenal duplication. Environment department is another area. We have a federal environment department, which is really, in many cases, just duplicating what the state environment departments do. Each state has its own environment department. Sometimes the state and the federal government environment people can be just tripping over each other. We recently had a hearing looking into the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Act, the Commonwealth Act, and we heard stories from witnesses of people who've been asked exactly the same questions by state governments as federal governments. And of course, there are bureaucrats employed by us, paid for by our taxes at both levels. So and that's just the beginning. Let's not even get started on whether everyone on a disability support pension should be on one. Everyone getting age pension should be getting one. All of those things.